Officer Dean Harper stood silently over the disturbed grave as the wind rustled the tall grass around him. The dogs continued to dig with tireless urgency, their movements careful but relentless. One of the men, older black dog with a noticeable limp, paused only to glance up at him, then pressed his snout into the earth again. It wasn't wild behavior. It was deliberate. Focused. He turned back toward his cruiser and radioed dispatch. "Yeah, it's Harper. I need to request a temporary barrier and permission to secure a gravesite for inspection. Cemetery on Oak Ridge Lane. Something's off here." Back at the station, his request raised eyebrows. No one in Maple Hollow could recall a time the police had ever been involved in something like this, but his reputation as a level-headed officer gave weight to the request. Within hours, a small team was assembled, just enough to begin a careful inspection without drawing too much public attention. The next day, yellow tape circled the grave. The dogs were nowhere in sight for the first time in days, almost as if they sensed that the humans were finally listening. Linda Moretz arrived early to observe from a distance. She didn't want to interfere, but she felt responsible. She brought a thermos of tea and sat on the bench beneath the big oak, keeping quiet and alert. 2 officers and a forensic technician named Molly Pearson began work. Molly had been with the county's forensic unit for years, but had never dealt with a case that started because of dogs. As the soil was removed in layers, she grew more curious than skeptical. "I don't know what we're looking for," she said to Harper, "but something brought them back here again and again. That's not normal." They reached the coffin. By mid-afternoon, to everyone's surprise, it didn't match the materials listed in the old burial record. The record showed a basic pine casket. This one had polished oak panels and newer hardware. Molly knelt beside it, brushing the last bit of dirt away. "This wasn't buried in '92, she said, tapping the corner gently. "Or, if it was reburied more recently." Harper's jaw tightened. He could feel something turning in his gut. The coffin had no nameplate, no symbol, just smooth, unmarked wood. Linda stepped a bit closer, her curiosity overriding her caution. From the distance, she called out, "Do you think someone tampered with the grave?" Molly didn't answer right away. She removed a pry bar from her kit and worked the edges of the coffin's lid. With a soft groan, the wood creaked open. A hush fell over the site. Inside lay the body of an older man, in a faded suit, likely Martin Elridge, but beside him, wrapped in an old pink blanket, was a second form, smaller, much smaller. Everyone froze. Molly slowly lifted the edge of the blanket. Even without immediate lab results, they all knew what they were seeing. The shape, the size, the shoes that peeked out, tiny, worn, covered in dust. It was a child. Harper immediately called for backup and sealed the site. Linda stepped backward, her face pale, her voice barely a whisper. "Oh my lord, ... The dogs knew." By the time the sun dipped below the trees, news of the discovery had started to spread across town. People who had dismissed the dog's behavior now felt a chill in their bones. What had looked like aimless digging was, in truth, a desperate attempt to reveal something long hidden, something unspoken for decades. The dogs returned that evening, sitting quietly at the edge of the police tape. They didn't bark. They didn't move. They just sat, watching. And the town of Maple Hollow realized, for the first time, that they might not be dealing with a mystery. They were standing at the edge of a forgotten story, begging to be told. The gravesite was sealed off completely by the next morning. Bright yellow tape fluttered in the breeze, and 2 uniformed officers stood nearby, keeping onlookers at a distance. Word had traveled fast. Maple Hollow was a small town, and once a secret began to crack open, it spread like wildfire. Forensic technician Molly Pearson stood quietly over the casket, now fully exposed. The man inside, presumably Martin Elridge, still wore a dusty gray suit. Though time had faded, it impartially collapsed the lining. But all eyes were on the second form beside him, the smaller one, wrapped in a pink, faded blanket that looked homemade. Molly carefully adjusted her gloves and leaned closer to begin documenting. "What's the next step?" Officer Dean Harper asked as he flipped through his notepad. Molly didn't look up. "We'll have to remove both remains for a full examination. I've already called for a forensic anthropologist from the county. But I can tell you this isn't supposed to be here." "Martin Elridge was buried alone," Harper said, more to himself than to anyone else. "No next of kin, no mention of a child. Nothing in the town records." Linda Moritz stood outside the tape line, watching from under her umbrella. A few neighbors had joined her, but no one dared speak above a whisper. It felt like something Sacred was being uncovered, something that had waited far too long to be seen. The dogs returned again just after noon. This time there were only two, the black dog with the limp and a golden retriever with a torn collar. They sat on the hill nearby, not digging, just observing. Quiet guardians of a truth long buried. Harper crouched beside the casket and gently lifted the edge of the pink blanket. What he saw sent a wave of unease through him. The child's small frame appeared delicate, with shoes that looked hand-stitched, and a small stuffed rabbit pressed tightly against her chest. It was heartbreaking. No headstone, no record, nothing. He muttered, "It's like she was never meant to be remembered." Molly nodded grimly. Well, someone hoped she wouldn't be. Hours later, a truck arrived to transport the casket to the county forensic lab. The removal was respectful and slow. Even the officers moved more carefully than usual. Everyone could feel the weight of what they were uncovering. A child buried in secret, undocumented, unremembered, and only discovered because of a group of persistent dogs. Harper called City Hall and requested any archived files on Martin L. The clerk, an older man named Gordon, promised to dig through the older boxes stored in the back room. By evening, Harper sat alone at his desk, staring at a blurry photo of Martin Elridge, taken back in the early 90s. He was balding, with deep-set eyes and a long nose. No records of marriage, no children, no relatives ever claimed his belongings. But a name surfaced in the early files. A child, Rosie Lynn, a foster child, briefly placed in Martin's care in 1992. There were no updates after that. No transfer notice, no withdrawal, no adoption, just a single line. Stamped placement approved. March 1992. After that, silence. Harper leaned back in his chair, frowning. She never left. The realization hit hard. The next morning, Linda knocked on the station door, holding an old photo album. She had once worked as a substitute teacher for the foster care center in the early 90s. She believed she remembered Rosie, a shy girl with dark hair and a gap between her front teeth. She flipped through the pages until she landed on a class photo. "That's her," she whispered, pointing at the smallest girl in the front row. "That's Rosie Lynn." Harper took the photo, heart heavy. The town had forgotten. The system had forgotten. But somehow, the dogs had not. Something deeper was unfolding, something beyond stray animals and a sealed grave. A chapter from the town's history had been ripped out and buried. And now, piece by piece, it was being written back in. The discovery of the child's remains next to Martin Elridge's body had shaken the town of Maple Hollow to its core. But what haunted Officer Dean Harper the most was how easily Rosie Lynn had slipped through the cracks. No adoption records, no medical files, no withdrawal from the foster system. It was like the little girl had vanished in the spring of 1992, and no one had asked a single question since. Harper sat in the records room beneath Town Hall, surrounded by boxes of old files, their edges yellowed and curling with time. He flipped through foster care reports from that year, one after another. Most were neatly organized. Children had transfer forms, visit logs, monthly reports from caseworkers. Rosie's file was one of the thinnest, just 3 pages. Her placement date was listed March 5, 1992, assigned to Martin Elridge, a retired carpenter. No red flags noted. But what puzzled Harper most was the abrupt end to the file. No follow-ups. No social worker signatures after the first visit. No documentation of removal. It was as if the file had been closed. Not because Rosie left, but because someone had stopped looking. Harper rubbed his temples. That doesn't happen by accident. He called Molly Pearson, who was now at the county lab. She confirmed that preliminary tests dated the child's death to the early 1990s, just weeks or months after the supposed placement. There were no obvious injuries on the skeletal remains, but further testing was underway. Molly was hopeful DNA results would match the name Rosie Lynn if they could find surviving records or relatives. Meanwhile, the town buzzed with speculation. Local news had picked up the story after someone from the cemetery staff leaked it to a reporter. Headlines across the region now read, "Unmarked child's body found in shared grave after dogs uncover clues." Linda Moretz received calls from reporters, but she refused to speak. Instead, she focused on the dogs. The same 3 had returned daily, resting near the site as if standing watch. The black dog with the limp, whom she had started calling Guardian, was particularly protective. He would not eat until she placed food near the grave. "It's like they were sent here," she said quietly to Harper one afternoon, standing just outside the police line. Like they knew someone had been forgotten. Harper nodded. I'm starting to believe they did. He decided to visit the old neighborhood where Martin Elridge had lived. The house, a worn-down structure with a sagging porch, had been vacant since his death. Harper tracked down a neighbor who had lived across the street for nearly 40 years. Her name was Mrs. Keller, a retired nurse in her 80s. She squinted at the photo of Martin and nodded. He was quiet, kept to himself mostly. But I remember that little girl. Harper leaned forward. You do? Mrs. Keller nodded again. Sweet thing. Always had a toy rabbit with her. I saw her maybe 3 or 4 times out front. But then she just disappeared. Did you ever ask what happened? He told me the agency came and took her back. Said it didn't work out. But no one ever came for her, far as I know. And after that, he stopped talking to people altogether. Harper felt a cold knot form in his chest. The only person who might have known the truth was Martin himself, and he had taken that secret to the grave. Literally. Back at the station, Harper pinned Rosie's photo on a board next to Martin's and wrote in bold letters above them, "Why was she never reported missing?" The deeper he dug, the more troubling it became. Someone in the system had either failed Rosie or erased her, and yet, somehow, after all these years, a group of dogs had refused to let the silence remain. They had returned, day after day, digging, not just through soil, but through a lie buried beneath the surface of a quiet town. Now it was Harper's turn to keep digging. He wasn't just searching for answers. He was chasing justice for a little girl who had waited over 30 years to be found. By now, the entire town of Maple Hollow was holding its breath. The strange mystery had gone beyond an odd gravesite and some persistent stray dogs. That unearthed child beside Martin Elridge had ignited an old flame of questions no one had asked for decades, and Officer Dean Harper wasn't about to let it die out. It was late in the evening when a call came through from Molly Pearson at the county forensic lab. Harper, who had just brewed his 3rd cup of coffee, picked up quickly. "We've confirmed. The second set of remains belongs to a child between 5 and 7 years old. And get this, DNA results show a match in the system," Molly said. Harper straightened. "A match?" "Yes, it's Rosie Lynn. Full name, Rose Lynn May. Lynn, she was registered as a ward of the state in 1992. Her biological mother was a woman named Evelyn Lynn, who passed away in a car accident that same year. Rosie was placed into emergency foster care." Harper scribbled notes. "And after that, she vanished from every record," Molly replied. "No exit form. No medical updates. It was like the placement with Elridge was the last entry in her life." Harper hung up and stared at the board in front of him. Rosie's photo now looked less like a ghost of the past and more like the beginning of a terrible oversight or something worse. But then came something even more unexpected. Early the next morning, a second call came. This time from Paul, the cemetery groundskeeper. "You might want to come down here," Paul said. "It's the same dogs, but they're at a different grave." Harper arrived at the cemetery just as the sun was breaking over the hills. The dogs had gathered again, not around Rosie's resting place, but near another grave, only a few rows away. This one was even older. The headstone nearly unreadable. Guardian, the black dog, had already started digging, his paws moving the earth, slowly, but with purpose. Harper stepped over carefully and knelt down. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. The grave marker bore the name E. Ashby, 1989. Another solitary burial with no flowers, no signs of visitors, and no digital record found in the town's system. Harper called in a small team again. Though some questioned opening another grave, he knew better now than to ignore the dogs. Hours later, the earth was pulled back, and another coffin was revealed, smaller this time. What they found inside stopped everyone cold. There was no adult, only one body. A teenage girl. No identification. No coffin liner. No official burial record. Just an unregistered, unofficial burial under the name E. Ashby, which matched no one in the foster or death records of that year. Harper's heart sank. How many more? Molly, who had rushed over when she heard the discovery, examined the remains. She's older, maybe 13 or 14. This wasn't a legal burial. Linda stood nearby once again, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as the dogs quietly sat watching. "I don't think they're just leading us to Rosie's story," she said softly. "I think they're trying to show us something bigger, something that's been hidden for a long time." Harper didn't want to believe it. The idea that more children might be buried here without records, without justice, without names, it was more than Maple Hollow could bear. But he also couldn't. Ignore the pattern. And the dogs, those silent messengers, were not finished. He ordered a quiet review of every unmarked or unusually marked grave in the cemetery. There were 6 more. 6 graves, all with vague initials. No flowers, no families, no maintenance. Requests. And everyone dated between 1986 and 1993. Suddenly, the picture was no longer about a single mistake. It was a pattern. A quiet pattern buried under the roots of Maple Hollow. Covered with years of silence. But the earth was giving up its secrets now, one paw print at a time. Officer Dean Harper stood at the edge of the cemetery, staring at the 6 unmarked graves flagged by his team. The wind pushed gently through the grass, but all he could hear was the question echoing through his mind. How had this happened right under their noses? He returned to the station with a fire in his chest. These weren't simple oversights or paperwork errors. These were children, each buried with barely a name, no family acknowledgement, and no traceable records. It was a pattern, too deliberate to be ignored. Harper compiled all the data they had. Placement records, missing files, names with only initials. One name kept appearing in foster care logs between 1986 and 1992. Clara Wexley, a now retired social worker who had managed dozens of placements during those years, including Rosie Lynn's. He decided it was time to visit her. Clara lived just outside town in a small cottage tucked behind a curtain of overgrown trees. She was nearly 80, her hands weathered from age but her eyes still sharp. When Harper explained the reason for his visit, she stiffened noticeably. "I haven't heard that name, Rosie, in decades," Clara said, brushing a strand of silver hair behind her ear. "She was one of my last cases before I stepped away." Harper leaned forward. "There are inconsistencies in the file. She was placed with Martin Elridge, but there's no record of her removal or transfer. Can you tell me what happened?" Clara sighed heavily. That spring, everything was chaotic. The office was short-staffed. Cases moved too quickly, and some placements weren't followed up the way they should have been. I remember Martin seemed like a quiet man, lonely, but polite. I thought it would be a stable home, but she disappeared. Harper said. Clara looked down. "I visited once. She seemed withdrawn, like something was wrong, but she wouldn't say. When I came back 2 weeks later, Martin said she had been taken back by another agency. He gave me a form that looked official. I didn't question it." Harper frowned. "Did you verify it?" "I didn't," Clara admitted. "I know how that sounds now. But I was overwhelmed. I thought maybe someone else had taken over the case. That gap in judgment, that one misstep, had buried a child for decades." Clara gave Harper a name: George Mallory, the regional foster coordinator at the time. He had signed off on several of the placements now under scrutiny. Harper looked him up and discovered that Mallory had moved out of state, now living in a retirement community 2 towns over. When Harper visited him the next day, George Mallory didn't deny knowing Martin Elridge. Martin had a reputation for being discreet, he said, his voice tired but steady. He requested children who wouldn't stay long. Said he was helping in emergencies only. Harper's blood ran cold. "And you allowed it?" "We didn't have options back then," Mallory replied, staring out a window. "There were too many kids, not enough homes. We cut corners. I didn't know any had died." "But they did," Harper said. "At least 2 so far. Maybe more." Mallory didn't answer. He just sat in silence, the weight of his decisions pressing into the room like fog. Back in Maple Hollow, the dogs had moved again. Guardian now sat near the 6th unmarked grave one. Harper hadn't yet examined. Linda, who had returned each day to feed and comfort the dogs, called Harper with a soft urgency in her voice. "I think there's one more child down there," she said. "The dogs won't leave." Harper arrived and stood over the grave. G.P.-1990 was the only inscription. No date of birth, no message, no visitors, just dirt and time. He knelt beside Guardian and placed a hand on the dog's head. "You found them, all of them." This wasn't just a series of buried bodies. It was a buried truth, secret that had been protected by silence, fear, and neglect. But the dogs had unearthed it, driven not by logic, but by something far deeper: instinct, loyalty, and maybe, in their own way, justice. And Harper knew. Now, he would not stop until every child had a name. Every story had an ending. And every grave had someone standing over it who remembered. The town of Maple Hollow had changed. What was once a sleepy, predictable place was now heavy with unspoken questions. Police tape fluttered through the cemetery like silent warnings. Families visited their loved ones with quiet glances. toward the unmarked plots, as if afraid of what truth might still be sleeping beneath the grass. Officer Dean Harper met with forensic technician Molly Pearson at the county lab 2 days after the sixth grave was examined. Her face was pale from long hours of work, but her voice remained steady as she handed over the latest report. "We've identified 3 more of the 6 buried children," she said. Each one had a missing persons record in the state system. From the late 1980s, one was from a nearby town, another from 2 counties over. The third, Genevieve Parker, age 13, was reported missing in 1990. That matches the grave labeled. GP Harper stared at the names, so they weren't even all local. Molly nodded. "That's what worries me. This isn't just about one man or one town. These kids were pulled from different places and somehow ended up buried in the same cemetery. Somehow, all connected to Martin Elridge. But Martin wasn't a registered foster parent after 1992, Harper said, flipping through the documents. "That's true," Molly said. "But he didn't need to be if someone was funneling them through the back door." Harper knew exactly who she meant. George Mallory. The pieces were falling into place, and they formed a chilling picture. Desperate foster care workers, overwhelmed by rising caseloads and shrinking resources, had turned a blind eye to shortcuts. Some placements bypassed checks. Some kids weren't followed up. And in those gaps, children disappeared, forgotten by the system, and, for years, unnoticed by the world, all except the dogs. It still puzzled Harper. Why had the dogs gone straight to Rosie's grave after decades of silence? Why her, and why now? Later that afternoon, he visited Linda Moretz. She was sitting on her porch, sipping tea with Guardian at her feet. The dog had grown thinner in recent days, less restless, almost satisfied, as if his work was nearly done. "Do you think they remembered her?" Harper asked, sitting across from her. "These dogs, do you think they knew Rosie personally?" Linda smiled sadly. "I've thought about that. Maybe they're descendants of dogs who did. Or maybe they lived near something, smelled something. I don't know, but I don't think it was a coincidence." Guardian wagged his tail gently, his eyes fixed on Harper with a quiet intelligence that couldn't be ignored. That evening, Harper met with the mayor and town council. He presented everything: documentation, forensic reports, recorded interviews, grave photos. At first, the room was stunned into silence. Then came the questions. What could the town do now? Who should be held responsible? Could the state be involved? "I don't know how deep this goes yet," Harper admitted, "but I do know this: we can't pretend we didn't see it." The council voted unanimously to open an independent investigation with state oversight. Funds were allocated to preserve and properly mark each child's grave. Memorials would be planned. But more importantly, Harper was given the authority to pursue charges. Any living individuals were found responsible for the mishandling, negligence, or silence surrounding these deaths. Meanwhile, local media returned to the story, this time painting a picture of a town not covering up, but confronting. Headlines shifted from shock to resilience. A town faces its forgotten children. From silence to justice. The Maple Hollow Graves investigation. As the investigation deepened, new witnesses began to come forward. Retired nurses, former clerks, even a foster sibling, who once shared a home with Rosie before she was sent to Elridge. Each account added another layer of truth. Each name found was another child returned to memory. But through it all, the dogs remained. Guardian, especially, had become a quiet symbol of something far greater than instinct. He was a messenger, one who had waited faithfully until someone finally listened. Harper stood again by Rosie's new headstone, which now bore her full name, a photo, and fresh flowers placed there daily by strangers. Guardian lay beside it, peacefully. And for the first time since the investigation began, Harper let himself believe that maybe even in the darkest places, truth could still rise from the ground. The town of Maple Hollow had always taken pride in its quiet charm, its tree-lined streets, and neighborly traditions. But now, the atmosphere had changed. Where there had once been silence, there was now movement, people asking questions, demanding answers, and gathering around a shared sense of responsibility. Officer Dean Harper stood at the entrance of the cemetery, watching a small crowd gather near Rosie Lynn's newly restored grave. Children placed flowers at the base of a headstone, while adults bowed their heads in reflection. A new plaque had been added beside the stone. "You are not forgotten. Your story will be told." Next to it, 5 more headstones had been placed. Each bore the name of a child whose identity had been confirmed through DNA and case files. 2 graves remained unnamed. For now, they were marked simply with the words, "In memory of a life cut short. You are loved." Guardian, the black dog with the limp, rested nearby, his body curled beside Rosie's grave. He didn't move as people passed. Some patted his head gently. Others simply looked at him with a mix of gratitude and awe. Linda Moritz stood quietly, with a bouquet of daisies in her hand. She had never imagined that a morning walk and a group of stray dogs would lead to all this. In many ways, she felt Rosie had chosen her to carry the burden forward. Harper approached her. "She's finally being seen," Linda said softly, placing the daisies down. He nodded. "All of them are." Across town, more changes were unfolding. A statewide investigation had been launched into the foster care system of the late 1980s and early 1990s. Dozens of files were reopened, and a task force was created to track the placement records of every child who had gone missing or unaccounted for during that time. George Mallory, the former regional coordinator, was brought in for questioning. Though now elderly, his testimony helped piece together how unchecked placements, lack of accountability, and desperation had created the perfect storm for children to fall through the cracks. While he denied knowingly placing children in harm's way, it was clear that his negligence had played a role. Clara Wexley, the social worker who had once visited Rosie, publicly apologized at a town meeting. Standing on stage, voice trembling, she said, "I failed a child who trusted me, and I carry that with me every day. But I will spend the rest of my time making sure no other child is ever forgotten again." Her words were met with silence, by applause, not out of celebration, but from acknowledgement. Maple Hollow had taken the first step toward healing. Back at the cemetery, volunteers arrived daily to clean, replant, and repaint the old sections. A small bench was installed near Rosie's grave with a carved quote, "Even the smallest voice deserves to be heard." Children in local schools wrote letters to Rosie and the others, leaving them in a small box by the grave. Some wrote poems, others drew pictures. One note simply said, "I'm sorry we didn't find you sooner." And through it all, the dogs remained. Some were adopted by residents. Others stayed near the cemetery, watched over by volunteers. Guardian, however, never left Rosie's side. Linda had officially adopted him, but she understood that his heart belonged to that patch of earth where truth had finally come to light. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the maple trees, Harper returned to the cemetery alone. He sat on the bench, staring at the headstones now lined in a neat row. "These graves used to be shadows," he whispered. "Now they're names, faces, stories." He glanced at Guardian, who lifted his head briefly, then laid it back down as if satisfied. The town had changed. Not in ways that were loud or flashy, but in the way it carried itself. With more awareness, more care, more willingness to face the past. Maple Hollow had once buried its truth, but now, because of a few forgotten children, a retired teacher, and a dog that refused to give up, it had learned that the past doesn't stay buried forever. And sometimes, all it takes to start a change is for someone or something to dig. Months had passed since the first grave was uncovered. What began with 3 persistent stray dogs digging at a forgotten patch of soil had transformed into a story that reached far beyond Maple Hollow. Reporters came and went, documentaries were planned, and letters poured in from across the country. People who had never heard of Rosie Lynn now knew her name, her story, and the quiet heroism of the animals that refused to let her remain hidden. The town had changed, not just on the surface, but at its core. The cemetery, once overgrown and overlooked, had become a place of remembrance. Trees were trimmed, walkways were added. A wrought iron sign now welcomed visitors with the name, Children's Meadow, a place of memory and light. It wasn't just a name, it was a promise. Officer Dean Harper stood beside Rosie's grave one bright spring morning, his uniform jacket resting over his shoulder. The birds chirped above, and the grass had finally grown back, where the digging had once disturbed the ground. Beside him, Guardian sat, older now, his muzzle grayer than before. He had grown slower, needing help to climb steps or rise from the ground, but he never strayed far from Rosie's side. In many ways, he had become the town's silent guide, leading them not just to the truth, but to the lesson hidden within it. Linda Moritz joined Harper on the bench, a picnic basket in her hand. She had taken to visiting every weekend, often bringing a few treats for Guardian and extra flowers for the children's graves. "They're going to put a statue here," she said, gently laying out sandwiches. "Of Guardian. Sitting just like that." Harper smiled. "He deserves it." "So do you," she added, Glancing at him, Harper looked out over the cemetery. All I did was listen. Linda shook her head gently. You listened when no one else would. You kept digging when others stopped. That matters. The investigation into the foster care placements of the late 1980s and early 90s had expanded beyond Maple Hollow. Several towns across the state began checking their own records. New standards were implemented for tracking foster placements, especially in small communities where resources had once been limited. The state governor even visited Maple Hollow to acknowledge the town's courage in facing its past. During his speech, he awarded Linda and Harper certificates of civic bravery. But it was Guardian who stole the show, his photo on the front page, curled peacefully beneath Rosie's bench as children laid wreaths around him. No one could explain how the dogs knew. Scientists speculated about scent memory, residual trauma, even the migration patterns of strays. But for the people of Maple Hollow, it didn't matter how. It mattered that they did. It mattered that they came, that they stayed, and that they refused to let silence win. As summer approached, a memorial service was held for all the children buried in the newly restored section of the cemetery. People came from near and far, some traveling hundreds of miles. A choir of schoolchildren sang a song written in Rosie's honor. One by one, candles were lit, one for every child's name, and two for those whose names were still unknown. Harper stood before the crowd and spoke simply. We can't change the past, but we can make sure it's never forgotten. And we can promise, with everything we have, that it never happens again. That night, after the crowd had left and the candles had flickered out, Guardian remained at Rosie's grave. Linda sat beside him for a long while, her hand resting on his back. She whispered to him softly, "You did it, sweetheart. You brought her back." Under the stars, in the silence of the night, a breeze passed through the trees, and it felt, for the first time in a long time, like peace. Rosie Lynn's story had finally been told. The others, too, had names and voices once more. Justice hadn't come with sirens or headlines, it had come on quiet paws, with gentle hearts, and the unwillingness to forget. And as the town of Maple Hollow moved forward, it did so carrying the memory of its lost children, not as a scar but as a promise never to bury the truth again.